Hi, I'm Yaakov Katz, and welcome to another episode of the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. When Donald Trump returned to the White House in January, Israelis across the political spectrum saw him as a breath of fresh air. After more than a year of a devastating war, finally, many people thought there was a U.S. president who seemed ready to stand unequivocally by Israel's side without any diplomatic daylight. And Trump did act quickly. He lifted the sanctions that had been imposed by his predecessor, Joe Biden, on West Bank settlers. He openly threatened Iran with military action and even hinted, if you can remember back in the beginning, at his potential readiness to allow Israel to annex parts of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. Most significantly, even before taking office, together with his Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, he helped broker the release of Israeli hostages held by Hamas. But now, a few months into Trump's second term, that initial enthusiasm, it's gone away. There's a change in perception in Jerusalem, and it stems from several recent developments, which to many here have caused concern that there is a shift in this administration's Middle East policy. The first sign of concern was Trump's trip to the Middle East this week. His itinerary included stops in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, but not Israel. It was reminiscent for many of Barack Obama's 2009 Middle East visit when he traveled to Cairo and Riyadh, but also then he bypassed Jerusalem. Back in 2009, what Obama did was interpreted as a deliberate diplomatic snub. And the same questions are coming up once again. Is Israel no longer a priority for Donald Trump? Then there was Trump's announcement that he had reached a deal with the Houthis to stop attacking ships that were traveling through the Red Sea. That deal did not include a stop to attacks against Israel. And as I record this on Wednesday, May 14th, just a few hours ago, I was myself in a bomb shelter because another Houthi missile was making its way towards Israel and Jerusalem. But the concerns don't end just there. Trump also appears to be moving fast towards finalizing a new nuclear deal with Iran, very similar to the JCPOA, the 2015 nuclear deal that Barack Obama made with Iran, in which Donald Trump pulled out of famously in 2018. Is Israel part of the talks? Is Israel not part of the talks? Seems that Israel is not. There's the reports of a nuclear program that he is going to allow for Saudi Arabia, the sale of F-35 Joint Strike Fighter jets to the Saudis, as well as maybe to the Turks. And taken all together, these developments have many Israelis privately questioning the depth and sincerity of Trump's supposed pro-Israel stance. Was that initial wave of enthusiastic support genuine, or was it something else? And I think that there's also another crucial perspective here, one that Israelis have historically struggled to fully grasp. And that is that relations with America are not a zero-sum game. All of this is what I talk about today with my two guests, Shmuel Rosner and Gil Troy, both of JPPI. We dive deep into what has changed, if anything has changed, with the Trump administration. What can Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's embattled prime minister, do to maybe go back into the good graces of Donald Trump and his administration? And what's going to happen in the days and weeks ahead when it comes to the hostages who are still languishing in captivity in Gaza, as well as the hundreds of thousands of IDF reservists who have been called up and are being told that in just a matter of days, we might be heading back into Gaza, into a wider and more expansive war against Hamas. Here we go. Shmuel Rosner, Gil Troy, it's great to have you both back on the podcast. It's been a while.
Great to be here.
So there's so much going on, it's almost difficult to know where to begin. But I'll start with the really big question here, which I think a lot of Israelis are asking themselves, and definitely a lot of American Jews are asking, is, has Donald Trump changed when it comes to the state of Israel? And we are talking, because I really wanted this to come out, or for us to speak as close as we could to when the podcast would come out. So we're speaking Wednesday, May 14th, just in the early afternoon. And just a couple hours ago, Donald Trump in Saudi Arabia met with President of Syria, Ashara, someone who in Israel has been referred to as a jihadist in a suit. The president has already also there decided to remove the sanctions that had been on Syria. But even more importantly to our discussion are reports that Benjamin Netanyahu had asked Donald Trump not to lift those sanctions. And once again, Donald Trump decided not to adhere to the Israeli request and decided to do what it was in, I guess, his interest or in America's interest here. So, Shmuel, I'll start with you. Has Trump changed?
I don't think he changed. I think Israelis didn't understand him well enough in the past 8 years, and that's why some of them think that he changed, because previously his policies seemed to favor Israel, and now his policies suddenly look somewhat different than in the past. But I think Trump is fairly consistent, both in expressing his sentiments and his priorities. And what changed is reality. The situation changed, and hence some of the policies changed. But, you just gave the example of the meeting with the new leader of Syria. Donald Trump was always a person who agreed to meet with everybody, from the leader of North Korea to the last leader of any jihadist state. He does not say no to a meeting. So he's consistent in a way by agreeing to meeting this new leader of Syria. And the fact that Israelis got used to the idea that there is compatibility between the policies of the United States and what Israel wished to happen, this was true when Trump wanted to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Then it was compatible. And now when we have Syria on the line, it's incompatible. But we see Donald Trump, again, fairly consistent.
So, Gil, would you agree with that assessment that Trump is the same? It's the circumstances that have changed. Maybe just add to the question. To me, also, it seems to some extent that Israel hasn't fully understood what's going on. That things have changed, as Shmuel spoke about. Donald Trump coming wants war's over, wants deals done, and we're still stuck. Whether legitimately or not, we're still fighting a war that he wanted over a long time ago.
I wouldn't call him consistent. I'd say he's consistently inconsistent. Trying to predict what Donald Trump is going to do is trying to predict how much hurricane damage is going to be wrought during hurricane season. And so there is a certain consistency in that he's extremely transactional. He's extremely impulsive. He very much responds to the headlines of the moment. Any Israeli who was so sure that he was our best friend was looking at the Abraham Accords and was looking at Jerusalem recognition, but forgot how angry Trump was at Netanyahu when Netanyahu did the right thing and recognized the fact that Joe Biden won the presidency in 2020. He forgets, or he or she forgets, that Donald Trump, shortly after October 7th, immediately dismissed Israel as losers. So the question isn't what has he done? The question is, how can Israel respond in an intelligent and thoughtful way? And I think part of the problem is that we are stuck in a series of conceptions, including that somehow Bibi Netanyahu has this magical hold on Donald Trump, or that Donald Trump is somehow committed to Netanyahu when Donald Trump is committed to Donald Trump. So this is definitely a fraught period. But, we're at the beginning of the week. Who knows what's going to happen Thursday, Friday, Saturday. But as a historian, let me put this in two contexts. One, you mentioned May 14th. Let's note that this is the day in the Gregorian calendar that Israel was established as a state. And no one knew what the United States would do, because even then there was a power struggle. And that's also what's going on in the Republican Party. There's a power struggle about how important is Israel. And George Marshall, who was a legendary general and Secretary of Defense, said, do not do this. And Harry Truman nevertheless did it. So we start by saying, God bless America, and seeing how much under Donald Trump and over the last 77 years, the United States has supported us. But we've heard also about this little Qatari gift, alleged gift. It hasn't necessarily gone through, of the
little is an understatement,
right? Of the $400 million jet. Well, during the Kennedy administration, when John Kennedy was being hosted by the Saudis, they gave him beautiful white stallions. And John Kennedy goes to one of his diplomatic aides. He goes, "What can I do? They give me these beautiful white stallions, and the Israelis give me some $12 Bible." Jackie Kennedy loved the horses, and she wanted to keep them. And Kennedy, because there were weird dynamics between Jack and Jackie, sends this diplomat to Jackie and says, it's really not good for the president to take the gift of the horses. She goes, I know it's a problem, but I want the horses. So the point is that we always have been playing this game. There have always been ups and downs in the U.S.-Israel relationship. A lot of it has to do with outside forces. A lot of it has to do with presidential agendas. And my best advice to the Israeli public would be wait and see over the next couple of days. My best advice to Israeli leaders would be figure out what we can do that works for us and for them. Because you have to, in order to understand Donald Trump, you have to see what Donald Trump is seeing, which is the headlines, which is Fox News, which is his impulse, which is his desire to be the big deal maker and to come home with $1 trillion worth of deals, and then try to ride the hurricane.
I mean, to me, it definitely does seem that Israel didn't fully understand where this administration was going, and I think you're right that there are different schools or factions within the administration. There's those who you could say are more of the isolationists. We saw them, for example, in the famous Signal Gate with the way that J.D. Vance was writing his messages about, then it was about Yemen, but you clearly understand that there is definitely a faction within the current administration that wants to see less engagement, less involvement in places like the Middle East and in these wars that Israel seems entangled in without a light at the end, of the figurative tunnel, but also in the Gaza tunnel for that matter. But the flip side is also, I think, that Israel, to some extent, and this is how it was portrayed, Shmuel, right? When Trump won the election and ahead of the election, it was very clear that this was Benjamin Netanyahu's preference was Donald Trump. And I think a lot of Israelis had this expectation that Bibi's going to get his way once again, right? He'll know how to reap those strategic benefits like he did in Trump's first term with the recognition of the Golan sovereignty and recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital and moving the embassy and pulling out of the Iran JCPOA nuclear accord. That's not happening now. And I'm wondering if the prime minister of Israel is going to also potentially pay here a political price, because if he wants to get on board, as Gil said, with President Trump's agenda, then there's a clear way to do that, end the war in Gaza.
Right. And he doesn't do it because then he'll pay an immediate political price by, dismantling his coalition and having to go to an election where he is likely to lose. So Netanyahu is playing here a short-term, long-term game. He, in order to maintain his coalition, he must navigate this tension between the demands coming from outside forces, including the United States, and the demands he gets from political allies within the coalition, whether it's Bezalel Smotrich talking about reoccupying Gaza or resettling Gaza or transferring all Gazans to an unknown third countries. Or if it's about the Haredi draft, he has the same issue with drafting people into the military, short-term needs, long-term necessities for Israel, and the pressures of the coalition. Right now, we see Netanyahu prioritizing the coalition over everything else. And I assume that this is because he knows what we all know when we look at the polls. If elections were to happen today, he is more likely to lose than to win. And that's why he postpones all decisions and makes only decisions that are likely to keep the coalition together, which puts him on a collision course with President Trump. Now, those Israelis who thought prior to the election or right after the election that Trump is going to play to the tune of Netanyahu's harp, I'd send them to sit in a history course taught by Gil, and then they'll realize that the United States here is navigating two tensions that we can go back to the 40s and 50s and see them coming and going time and again. One is the fight for the Middle East between the United States and other superpowers. Back in the 40s, it was the U.S. versus Britain fighting for influence within Saudi Arabia. Churchill sending a Rolls Royce to the Saudi king, Roosevelt responding by sending him an airplane. This was at the time when gifts were given by the superpowers to the Saudis. Then you had the battle between the United States and the Soviet Union for influence in the Middle East, and now you have the United States versus China fighting for influence in the Middle East. And if you ask what the Trump visit is all about, it's not about us. It's not about Israel. It is about the United States wanting to integrate the economy of the Gulf states into the American sphere of influence rather than the Chinese sphere of influence. That's the issue. That's the core interest of the United States. And every time the United States had to make a decision concerning its influence over the Arab world or losing it to some other superpower, every time it happened, Israel had a problem. Whether it's Roosevelt or Eisenhower or Kennedy or the Ford administration or the Carter administration, you can go back and forth. These two tensions always exist. The United States versus the other superpower, and Arab influence versus Israeli influence over the United States.
But so, Gil, I mean, let's take Shmuel up on his offer for a moment without going too far back in history, because I just think back to Biden, right? Biden, October 7th happens, horrific massacre, worst day since Israel's inception, and some would say since the Holocaust. Most Jews killed on a single day since the Holocaust. Israel taken completely by surprise, in trauma, prime minister and his government not functioning in the beginning. And Joe Biden makes a historic wartime visit, first time ever by a president, to the state of Israel. Gives Israelis a hug that makes Israel and Netanyahu an actual hug on the runway, on the tarmac, and gives Israelis a feeling that America stands with Israel. And re-injects confidence into the country to an extent, and into the government and to the military. Fast forward a few months after that, and there are questions about Rafah, and there's questions about the use of one-ton bombs, and then there's a delay to a shipment, and suddenly Joe Biden, from being the guy who loves us, who showers us with love and confidence and stands at our side, becomes an anti-Semite, right, in some circles. And so it got me to think, and I kind of agree with what both of you said in the beginning. I think Israelis don't understand America, right? I think that's maybe at the center of this problem of this high expectation with Trump, and now we're shocked. What happened? It must be a disaster, right? He's turned on us. I think there's the same story with Joe Biden, with how it goes from one extreme to the other. So maybe it's more about us than about them.
It's a little bit of both. You're absolutely right, and I'll see you and raise you. I think it's not just Israelis who don't understand America. Often American Jews don't understand America. And this all or nothing language. Barack Obama certainly was critical of Israel, but when people called him anti-Israel, I said, I'll show you on campus people who are truly anti-Israel. Why do you want to use that category? So, and of course, in America now, we're in this binary world where it's all or nothing. And so Donald Trump is either going to be Israel's absolute best friend, and now my Democratic friends are sending me all these emails saying, you see, or he's going to be Israel's greatest enemy. And, we should start perhaps with a damage assessment. For me, the most substantive damage that's been done in the last 2 weeks is that America made a deal with the Houthis and didn't include Israel. That's a slap in the face, and that's substantive. But on the scale of how disastrous it is, it's pretty minor. Because Israel, I think, can take the Houthis, and it's kind of an annoyance. It would be much worse if Israel had been betrayed over Iran. So I think we have to take what happens in proportion. That's number one. Number two, absolutely, we have to look broadly. It's not just the U.S.-Israel relationship. It's American foreign policy. So I agree with Shmuel that the game is about China, and the game is about Russia, and the game is about Turkey. That's another piece. Third, we're going to see a lot of things about how, Donald Trump is in the pockets of the Qataris and the Gulf states. Well, Wasn't it Barack Obama who turned to the Qataris and said, we trust you to help us with Hamas? And wasn't it Joe Biden who shifted the status of Qatar, who upgraded the status of Qatar and said that they're going to be a favored non-NATO ally? And wasn't it Joe Biden and President Trump who were relying on these wonderful mediators, the Hamas supporting Qataris? And I just read in the Washington Post, which tends to go left rather than right, an interview that was such a softball with the head of Qatar that to call it a softball is not to understand how soft it is. It's like a marshmallow in rose water. And Lally Weymouth, who is the daughter of the legendary Katharine Graham, who was a part of the foreign policy establishment, Washington establishment, asks the most basic questions, no follow-ups. It's the opposite of journalism. So the point is you have to, and then let's just add one more thing. I'll see you and raise you, a $45 billion Qatari sovereign wealth fund, which is buying up sports teams and the Plaza Hotel and investing in America at a time when that's really important to Donald Trump. So I think American Jews, Israelis, Democrats, Republicans, partisans just have to start looking at things in a much more complex way. Understand historically, that there's a deep, deep relationship between the United States and Israel, but that doesn't mean that it's always been smooth. Try rebuilding what was always the most important baseline, at least certainly since the 1980s, grew to 70% of Americans who in Gallup poll after Gallup poll supported Israel. And now in the last couple of months, we're seeing that flagging and we're seeing it becoming more partisan. That to me is the big warning sign. These trips will come and go. And again, let's wait and see what happens with Iran. And one last idea is that when you were talking at the very beginning, Shmuel, I was thinking about the Bibi who used to serve as prime minister and the Bibi who showed up since the November 2022 elections. Old Bibi would have taken the pressure from Trump and turned it into a way to get him off the hook with the coalition vis-a-vis the Gaza war. And then he would have had a win-win-win. He would have ended the Gaza war temporarily. He would have been able to free the hostages. He would have been able to say to Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, look, what can I do? And they read the same polls. They also don't want to run for re-election. And he might have been able to come out with the rabbit out of the hat that Bibi used to be able to do. I don't see this version of Bibi being able to pull that off. And that terrifies me.
By the way, I mean, the story, right, is also go back to the early Barack Obama's first term in office. Bibi comes back, right, March elections, forms a government, and goes to meet Barack Obama as president. And Barack Obama gives him the famous line, not one single brick, right? Don't build in the settlements. Bibi comes back to Israel and convinces his coalition to impose a 10-month settlement freeze, right? On the understanding that we need Obama for Iran, right? This is all about Iran. So your question of why is Bibi not playing this once again? He's done this numerous times since then. Of use the Iran threat, to say to Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, listen, guys, I want to keep fighting in Gaza, but if we have a bigger existential challenge on the horizon, if we don't give Trump the end of this war, we will be left alone and he will not help us with Iran. So, Shmuel, that leads me to the question I wanted to ask you, which is, what can Bibi do effectively to get back into the good graces of Donald Trump? Is it political manipulations like the ones that Gil wants to see come back, right? Or is it something that he needs to do? Maybe Israeli taxpayers need to buy a $500 million 747 and give it to Donald Trump. I mean, what can he possibly do?
Well, first of all, I don't think Israel can compete with the Saudis or the Qataris when it comes to giving gifts. We don't have the resources to give gifts as lucrative as they can give any American president. Netanyahu is in a bind. I do not want to be his defender, his attorney in this conversation. But what he could have done, or what he could do 10 or 15 years ago, he can no longer do today. The good grace that he can get from the Israeli public, and the reward they will hand him if he does the right thing, this is no longer something that he can count on. Netanyahu knows that there are many Israelis who will no longer vote for him, no matter what he does. He can bring down the moon. He can do whatever is necessary, and that's why we see him fighting so hard for this coalition. He is in a bind, and we, as a country, are in a bind because we have a prime minister who cannot win election unless he can, in some miraculous way, maintain his very narrow coalition. And that's why we see the most extremist element within the government dictating the policies of the government, which I'm sure Netanyahu himself understands aren't necessarily the right policies for Israel. So you ask me what he can do. He can do many great things, but he will ultimately lose his coalition for doing these things. He might lose the next election for doing these things. I would want my prime minister to do the right thing for Israel, even if this means risking the next election. But right now, we don't see Netanyahu willing to take such risk, and it is a significant risk. We must not deny that it is a significant risk, and we see him act with politics as a consideration and not the right policy for Israel.
I mean, by the way, as we're speaking today, when President Trump earlier in Saudi Arabia is meeting with the Shah, the president of Syria, and MBS, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, the de facto leader, where is Netanyahu? Sitting in the Tel Aviv district court, giving testimony in the corruption trial against him. I mean, those two images,
and asking for a pause to go have a phone call with Steve Witkoff, and then going back to testify. It's not a way to run a country.
No,
this is not a way to run a country.
So, Gil, as Bibi, I mean, you know, obviously the Shmuel just referred to the polling that shows that Netanyahu right now would not win an election. But with even that said, there still is a big bloc that does support him. Has he run out of steam?
Yeah, it breaks my heart that rather than talking about what needs to be done, we're talking about his political life and his political calculations and the polls. So that in itself shows a toxicity that partially comes from his enemies, but also comes from the way he has handled his prime ministership. And at some point, he and his supporters have to take responsibility. And I want to take a whole other dimension. As we're talking about this whole gift game. First of all, I want to point out that there was a Bible recently bought for $10 million, so they're not just $12 anymore. But more seriously.
You want to give it to Trump now?
More seriously, Israel has given the United States of America in the last year and a half extraordinary gifts. Israel has shown how to fight urban warfare in a way that's very, very effective. Israel has shown how to push back against the jihadi waves. Israel has shown all kinds of techniques in terms of how to save soldiers on the battlefield, which will save American lives. How come I'm saying it, but we're not hearing this from public diplomacy in Israel? How come we're not hearing this from our foreign minister? How come we're not hearing this from parts of the American Jewish community who are so busy being embarrassed by our bombs that they can't be proud of all that we've done under impossible situations? I think we have to start thinking, not only, and again, this is what I was saying earlier, we're stuck in these binaries, pro-Bibi, anti-Bibi, pro-Trump, anti-Trump, left, right, all or nothing. I think we all start take a breath back and start thinking about the broader story. The story of the last year and a half, the story of the last 77 years, and start telling it in a more effective way that works for us. And we can't always be outmanned or outpersoned by the latest Saudi Arabia.
But Gil, I don't want to interrupt you, and I
yes.
like the idea as an idea, but the problem is, I think that we are conditioned to an extent here in Israel not to see the grander or bigger picture. Right. Israelis have, I think often of October 7 as a coin with two sides. Right. One side is that terrible massacre, the immense failure. It's horrific and still has not been fully investigated. And still there are so many reforms that need to take place in our intelligence agencies and political echelon and Shabak and army. We could talk about that for days. But there's another side to the coin, and that is the re-engineering of the Middle East that we, the state of Israel, have done over the last 18 months. We've changed Lebanon. We brought about a tectonic change in Syria, right? We have weakened Hamas to the point that they're nothing like they were in the past, right? The Palestinian Authority in the West Bank has been completely sidelined and eviscerated, right? There is, the Iran is more vulnerable than ever before, and we could go on and on and on. But for all of that to really go somewhere, you need political courage. And Israelis don't see the bigger, because we don't have anyone who's taking us there and saying, this is where we're going to go. I think that's the great miss here to an extent.
No, I agree. Look, we're all living from moment to moment. We're in reactive mode, and we have a leadership that's doing the same thing. And you can only quote Churchill so many times, but you actually have to start learning from Churchill. And so the question really is, how do we start? And I want to defend Netanyahu partially because, in fairness to him, part of it has to do with the toxic dynamics that Shmuel was pointing to. That at this point, no matter what he does, because nobody's taking the break to say, let him lead us. No one's taking the break to say we need statesmanship here, and no one is, and no one in his coalition, I think, is also saying, you know what, I'm going to look for the long game. I'm going to be the source of that wisdom. We're seeing it a little bit with Yuli Edelstein, whom I've criticized before on this program. So now I want to give him props, as they say, for being the one who's saying, you know what, on the Haredi issue and the ultra-Orthodox issue, we have too many religious Zionists now who are furious. We have too many soldiers who are furious. We have too many Israelis who are saying, what the heck? Right now, in the middle of this war, right now, when we know so many people in our neighborhoods and in our families who are being called up again, who are putting their lives on hold again, that we're going to have some kind of ultra-Orthodox draft bill this week or next week to keep the coalition going. So I'm very happy to hear Yuli Edelstein's voice. I want to hear more. I want to hear those voices from the left and from the right. I want to hear it from the newspapers. I want to hear it from our diplomats. We're not hearing it. And I can only blame one man so much. Let him carry the burden. It goes back to, the failure of October 7th. Let him carry his burden. But all of us also have to think more broadly. And I think this is an interesting conversation, because what we're seeing is the degree to which the gravitational physics of the moment keep on pulling us down and dragging us into panic and dragging us into short-term decision-making without taking the breath, taking the historic view, taking the multidimensional view, and saying there are other things going on, and how do we win? I don't care about winning the headline of today. I don't care even about Israel feeling at the end of this week good about Trump's visit. I want us to have leaders who are thinking about what's it going to look like next month, what's going on in the long game with Iran, and what's going on in the longer game with Gaza and all these other fronts that are important, where we have made tremendous successes. And one of the things also, let's talk historically, Israel has often been all too good at winning military victories and then blowing the diplomatic victory. I want us to win the military victory and win the diplomatic victory.
I think we won the military victory. I think we've lost, as of now, the diplomatic political victory, because we're refusing, due to politics, to put into place a political resolution to the wars. I mean, you see, take Ashara just as one example, right? The guy from Syria, Gideon Sa'ar, you mentioned before, why isn't the foreign minister talking about the amazing things that Israel has achieved? Well, because Gideon Sa'ar is busy talking about how Ashara is a jihadist in a suit. Now, that might be, he was Al-Qaeda yesterday. This is very true. But the world has shifted. The reality has changed. Now, Israel has two options. One, keep occupying parts of Syria as it is, keep your soldiers in there, undermine the potential ability of that new government and regime to be able to govern within Syria, or try to get on board with America. I don't know which one is right. I'm not taking a side here, but there are sides to be taken. And as of now, Israel is on the wrong side of it. So Shmuel, at least from the Trump perspective for now, let's look forward for a moment. Trump is finishing up his visit. By Friday, he'll be done. He's in Qatar on Wednesday. Then he goes to the UAE. And then I think that's the trip, flies back to the United States. And there's some last second surprise. The release of Idan Alexander, the Israeli-American soldier who was released from Gaza, and everyone obviously ecstatic about that. But, one more hostage, thankfully, his life saved and brought back home, but saved and brought home because he's an American citizen, because he also, in addition to an Israeli passport, he has a U.S. passport. The reality, though, is that there's still 58 hostages. How many are alive? Well, if the number was 21 with Idan, it might now be 20. If it was 24, it's now 23. but there's about 20 who are alive. They're waiting to come back home. And the government is now once again negotiating with Hamas in Doha. There is a delegation of Israelis who are there. We have a couple options, right? This could go to a deal that sees more of the hostages come back in a ceasefire, but this could also go towards a further escalation. And when we look at the targeted killing or the targeting of Muhammad Sinwar, the brother of Yahya Sinwar, just on Tuesday, and as we speak, we still don't know for certain that he was killed in Khan Yunis, in that underground complex under the hospital that was bombed, but looking very unlikely that he was able to survive that bombardment that took place there. This is going to make making a deal even a little more difficult because now there's no one really on the ground in Gaza to pick up the phone. Now, long term, right? Long term, there's some expectation. You're hearing this from people in Jerusalem that he was more radical. The others who might replace him might be more flexible, but that will take some time to get the wheels turning on that. So, how do you see all this playing out?
Well, Israel is geared towards an expansion of a military operation. The idea was to wait for the end of the Trump visit and then re-enter Gaza with the ground forces and in some way restart the war, relaunch the war, the ground operation on a large scale in order to, again, pressure Hamas, eliminate it, get rid of it, force it out, whatever term you choose to use in order for Israel to achieve it. Predicting now on a Wednesday what's going to happen on a Saturday becomes almost impossible because the Israeli government has two problems on its hands. One is the Israeli, well, at least two. One is the Israeli public. I think the rationale behind the ground operation is becoming shakier and shakier as the hours pass. With the negotiation going on, we see the opposition of the United States. We see that the Middle East is not ready to accept another round of violence on a large scale in Gaza, and this could become a problem for the government with public support within Israel. The second issue is the support of the United States. We don't know yet what the Trump administration is telling the prime minister on concerning this plan. Do they tell him, do whatever you want, you know, you're on your own, but do whatever you want? Or do they tell him, look, if you relaunch the operation, you're in trouble? These are two different versions of the message that he can get from the United States. If they tell him, you know, do whatever you want, Israel is likely to start an operation, even if to save face, you know, to begin something, you know, begin rolling in and then, you know,
Pull back.
Go on with the,
right.
Yeah, but move forward the negotiations. And then after a few days, you can say, okay, we achieved what we wanted to achieve. It brought Hamas back to the table. They're now willing to accept things that they weren't willing to accept a week ago. And then you can save face and scale it down, you know, after a short time. If the Trump administration is telling Netanyahu, don't do it, then the problem on his hands is much more dramatic, and he will have to see what we can do with his coalition. He might be forced into a position in which he says to his ministers, look, we cannot do it. We will not get the support or the ammunition or the political cover from the United States. This is not the time for us to relaunch the operation. And then you have to release all the reservists that you already called in, etc. It's gearing up towards an operation is something that you cannot do every few days, time and again.
Right.
You did it now. If you don't use the forces, and you tell people now go back to your homes, you cannot, you know, decide in 7 or 10 days, oh, I now am going to do it after all. So for Israel, these are tense, difficult, and in some way even dramatic days.
And if we look at the polling that we've been doing at JPPI, what I think we also see is that the Israeli public, at least, does have fatigue of this war, and does, when it looks at what it's prioritizing, it would prioritize the release of the hostages over the continuation of or expanding the war to some extent. And that seems to be just the general sentiment that you have out there in the public, is that people want to see the hostages come back, even if that means, for example, not expanding the war right now.
Well, this depends really on how you ask the question. It's true that Israelis want to see the hostages back. It's also true that they're willing not to expand the war now. Are they ready to say we are willing to see Hamas remain in power in Gaza? That's a trickier question.
No,
Israelis do not want to see Hamas there. The question is, what better path leads you towards your strategic goal, which is to have Gaza without Hamas in power? And on this, we have an ongoing debate within Israel that is, with two camps unwilling to accept the other side's view.
Yeah. And Gil, you want to add something there?
Yeah, just three quick thoughts. First, the polls often say, with all the hostages returned. Well, that requires Hamas to be willing to return all the hostages, and they're having such a good time exploiting us and manipulating us and dividing us. I'm not sure that will happen. So I think we have to put that on the table. Second is, we always talk about replacing Hamas, but it only works if we replace Hamas with a better government, not an equally dictatorial, terroristic government supported by the Qataris, who one day pretend to be our best friends, and the next days
maybe the leader of Syria wants to take over,
are stabbing us in the back, and that requires real diplomacy, real skill, real vision, and real cooperation with the Americans on a very high stakes thing. And the third thing, someone with skin in the game, because my kids have already been called up, and we have colleagues who've been in and out or called up and down and being played like yo-yos. I think we have to put the tunnels on the table, because I don't really believe that this war will be ended until the tunnels are rendered useless. And I don't know what that means from an engineering or a military perspective, but I think we have to start articulating also some very specific battle desires, which can only occur once the hostages are out of the tunnels. But to me, the destruction of the tunnels, or the rendering them truly, and we've heard 5 times before over the last 17, 18 years that they were rendered useless, to really be, for me to be convinced, and I'm not a military analyst, let alone for someone like you, Yaakov, to be convinced, let alone for our generals to be convinced, is really has to be put on the table, because that is a very substantive and measurable war aim.
No,
and we now know that the rosy picture we used to get from the IDF a year ago, as if most of the tunnels are now gone. We now know that's not true. We
were told just a year ago, most of the tunnels gone, all the brigades of Hamas destroyed. Remember before Rafah, it was just Rafah, just those 3 battalions. And look at where we are in mid-May 2025, 19 months after October 7th. Hamas completely replenished in terms of its ranks and with tens of thousands of new fighters, maybe not as trained, maybe not as armed as well, does not have the rocket capability that we know, so that's off the table. But the tunnels, maybe now we hear estimates of maybe 40% that have been destroyed, which means hundreds and hundreds of miles of tunnels that still exist under Gaza. And some of them is where the hostages are. And this
one aim, to destroy us. Let's be very clear what those tunnels are for.
Correct. No, of course. Of course. And by the way, the tunnels, I know someone who wrote a book about the failures of the war, or the failures of what led to October 7th. And one of them that is so blatant is just our complete misunderstanding of what those tunnels were, how long they were, how big they were, how many there were, and why we went into October 7th, I think people don't know this, with really no intelligence on them, because our whole focus on tunnels were the tunnels that crossed into Israel. We didn't care about the tunnels inside Gaza, because those were, so when we bomb them, the bad guys will go down, but that was it. Never in our minds did we think we'd have such a long ground operation and have 251 hostages would be taken from Israel and be placed inside those tunnels. It was one of the great blindnesses of what led to October 7th. But on that wonderful optimistic note, let me thank both you.
Well, it's a Wednesday, so who knows?
Who knows?
Maybe by the time,
Let's evoke May 14th again, because it still is the land of miracles, and we're still better off than we were, as you pointed out, 19 months ago.
100%, Gil.
And 77 years ago.
And I thank you.
77 years ago.
And I thank you for bringing us back to a positive note. That's needed once in a while. But let me thank Gil Troy, Shmuel Rosner, and all of our listeners and viewers. Thank you for being with us. As you can find us, as always, where podcasts can be found: Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and the website of Times of Israel. And we'll be back next week with another episode of the Jewish People's